If you plan on doing some audio recording, there are a whole bunch of ways you can do that. You could use a mobile device to record your voice. You might have access to a microphone on your computer. If you choose to do this, you still might find that you're unhappy with the voice that you've recorded, and quite often everyone's voice, when they first hear it, they absolutely hate. So here's something that I've recorded of myself, and I'm not really happy with the sound of the voice, and so I want to manipulate it. And there are a number of ways you can do that. I'm using a program called Audacity. Audacity is free, but you could use the Adobe suite. Adobe Audition has all of this stuff. Really what I'm showing you is the idea of the techniques that you might choose to apply. So here's the voice.
Perfect for being in the office. And instead, I'm out on the street.
Now that doesn't sound very tough. I need my guy to sound really tough and like a kind of detective that you would actually be a bit intimidated by. So what I want to do is make this voice a lot deeper and a lot more bassy sounding. So I'm going to select the entire track. I'm going to go to Effects and choose Change Pitch. And I'm changing the pitch by a whole bunch. And again, this will be up to you how much you'd change it. It always depends on whatever audio that you're using. I've pre-tested this, so I'm happy with it, and I'm going to press OK. So now...
Perfect for being in the office. Instead, I'm stuck on the street.
So now my voice sounds a lot more deep and intimidating and a little bit more scary. And so you can see that this is a lot better. It's not quite right. I'll spend some time sort of fixing it up. But this is a way that you can really manipulate your voice without actually having to sound like the original character. In this video, we're going to go through some of the tricks and techniques that you can use to help you on your way in this graphic design project. So once again, I've loaded up this photograph, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to convert it into something that looks a lot more drawn, and then I'm going to cut it out so that I can apply it in a much more graphic design, in a much more graphic novel style. In Photoshop, I've got my background layer as this preloaded image, and I'm going to copy it because I want to just make sure that I always have a copy in case I make a mistake somewhere along the line. And then with the background copy now selected, I'm going to go to Filter, I'm going to go to Filter Gallery, and in Filter Gallery I've got a whole bunch of options, and I've chosen Reflection. I can spend a whole bunch of time changing all of these sliders, but I'm pretty happy with the default, so I'm just going to click OK. So I've got this result, but it's a little bit bright now. It's a little bit too, the blacks are all lifted and it's a bit washed out. So by pressing Ctrl L, I can bring up the levels. And if I select the dark area of the levels, I can drag that across and I can bring it back to the level that I want it to be. And so this is now about right. So I'm quite happy with that. So this is a much more drawn feel to it. It's a bit like the photograph. If I show you the original photograph, that's the original photograph. And this is where we're at. So I'm quite happy with that. It has a sort of comic-y feel. But now I want to add my color reference. So what I'll do is I'll add a new layer, and I'll come over here to my colors, and I'm going to add that yellow-orange look to this scene. And so I'm going to get my brush, and I'm going to paint over the top of this background door layer. And I'm being very rough, quite deliberately, because of the way this picture works. Depending on the picture that you might have to be a bit more careful about it. But okay, so now I've got my yellow image, and of course it looks terrible, but if I come up to my blending layers and I change it to color, now we have a black and white image with a really strong, vibrant yellow-orange color coming through. So that looks exactly like I wanted to, so I'm quite happy with that. But now I want to create a cutout. I want to cut my main character out of this picture because I want to be able to layer it. I want to be able to move this character separate to the background layer. But of course, this is a photograph, so this is a bit of a problem. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select my background copy, and I'm going to come up here to this button here. Now, you might have it on Lasso tool. It might look like that on your Photoshop. But what you want is the magnetic lasso tool. So I select that, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag, click, and then I'm going to follow the contour of where I want this lasso to create a selection. So if I click here, and I follow very carefully along the outside of my main character, you'll see that the lasso tool is creating a selection along the boundary of our character. So I don't have to do that myself. And you'll notice that as it gets to darker areas, it will struggle if it doesn't have a good amount of contrast. But it's not doing too badly. Now I'm going to cut out this front object too. And then when I close the loop, it creates the selection. And I can add to that selection. I've pressed M, so I can come back to my marquee tool if I want. And if I press Shift and I drag it across, this will add to the selection. And so I just make sure that the bottom is actually properly selected. And so now you can see that I've selected this entire character. And I'm pretty happy with that. So I'm going to cut it out of the background. So if I press Control X, now you can see I've cut out the character and we're seeing through to the background. So if I hide the background, you can see I've cut out the character from the background. So I'm going to make a new layer and I'm going to paste our character onto. So now I can move this character independently of the background. But of course that's not really working that great because we still have all of this cut out background. So this might look a bit like a problem at the moment. So Photoshop has a pretty cool trick that you can use. I'll hide my character for the moment and I'm going to come up to this selection here and I'm going to use the Content Aware Move tool. You don't actually have to use this. You could use the lasso tool again actually. So let's use the lasso tool. So using the lasso tool, I'm going to draw around the area that I've just cut out. And so now I have this sort of a cutout of a cutout. And with the background selected, I'm going to go to Edit and Fill. And with Fill, I'm going to use Content Aware. And I'm going to choose OK. And so now, using the available information from this cutout, it has automatically filled in the background. Now, obviously, this doesn't look that great. It doesn't look perfect. But it looks okay, especially when we add our character back in. And so now this gives us the option of moving the character around a bit while still keeping the scene looking like it's mostly right. And so this allows us to create that animated effect, that parallax that can happen with our character who's now been moving, who can now move separately to the environment that he's in. And so this has given us some freedom to actually create a dynamic feel to our scene. So now that you have the set, you can do a whole bunch of other things. Like you could add, for example, speech bubbles. And because this is all now separated, you can actually create a whole animated little series using these separated items. Now, in order to load this into your animation programs, you will need to export each layer individually. So let's have a look at what that looks like. The first thing is you can't export the color and the background layer individually. You have to compress these two together to maintain that visual color look. So the first thing to do is make sure that you're absolutely happy with your color before you do this. But with the color layer selected, and just to make sure that it's just above the background color, press Control E. And that will then compress that layer down and blend them together. So now this color is embedded into that one image. So look carefully at the layers. I've just undone that. I press Control E, and now layer 4 disappears and it becomes part of the background layer. So I'm now ready to save this. So I can just File, Save As, and save this particular image like it is right now. Then I can reveal our main character, and I have to hide everything else. And I can now save this with the background hidden. And you need to make sure that you're seeing these checker boxes, or however it is that you've set up Photoshop. You need to make sure that the background is transparent. So when you save this, make sure that you don't save as a JPEG. You have to save it as a PNG file. PNG files have alpha channels. So if you save it as a PNG file, it will save with this alpha channel embedded, and that means you can reveal it as a cutout on top of your background image. If you save it as a JPEG, this will turn white because JPEGs don't have transparencies. And then the same again, if you want to do your speech bubble, you can now layer this like that and just save it out as a PNG file, and this will layer in properly into wherever Adobe Animate, for example, if that's where you choose to animate this file. Now, just because you could animate in Adobe Animate doesn't mean that that's the only way to do it. So what I've done is I've loaded this up into Vortals, and you can see my different layers that I've set up. So first we have the background layer, and I've actually put it right in the background. And then we have our main character Cutout, who I've scaled a little bit, and I've moved him in front, quite a long way in front of the background. And then I've got my little speech bubble that exists much further in front. And if you look, I have animated the camera. So the camera moves from right to left, from left to right, and it does that in 10 seconds. So let's go to my camera view. And so you can see that by separating the layers, I now have the ability to create an animated system that looks really dynamic. So this is a really cool way of bringing energy into a scene if you don't have the time or the ability to draw and animate all of these different elements. And as a recap of this technique, here's an example from the Turtles. As part of your project, there are some assets that you can use. This is a detective's office. I haven't loaded any of the provided textures because I don't want to use them in my particular approach. I want to take you through one of the ways that you can approach lighting this, and one of the reasons why gathering reference is so important, because when I look at this scene, I now have a strategy by which I can light it. And what I mean by that is if I look at my reference, I can see how they've approached lighting it, and so now I can actually look to create that approach as well. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to remove all of the default lighting that are currently in the scene. So to do that, I'm going to add a black background, which removes all of the environment lighting. And then I'm going to go to Slide Properties and turn off default lighting. And now we have a completely dark scene. There's absolutely no lights in the scene, and we can't see anything. So I'm going to choose to add a light now. And if we go back to our reference, you can see that the lighting is very harsh. There's very sort of directional shadows coming in from the windows. So I'm going to look to replicate that. So the first thing I'll do is I'll add a direct light. And this direct light adds facing in one particular direction. So if I rotate this, this will give us some shadows. And you can see it gives us some reasonably sharp shadows. Yeah, so I'm quite happy with that. If I go to my camera position here, this is kind of lighting, kind of like how I want it, but I want this desk lamp to be on, and I want this desk lamp to show off this orange-yellow lighting. So I'm going to create a new light. I'm going to choose Spotlight. And I'm going to move it into position. And now that I have my spotlight in position, I'm going to give it a color. I'm going to match the color to our reference. And now when we look at this, we actually have some inspired color. And so you can see by having the reference, it's a much quicker process to choose and design your system like you want it. This is why I highly recommend going through and getting your reference first. Now, when you approach it, there's no reason why you have to have this desk lamp on. There's no reason why you have to have a direct light. All of these creative choices are up to you, but it'll make your life a lot easier if you have reference that you're trying to follow. So if I had been following any of these references, you'd see that the design that I would choose would be very different to this one. In the project example file from the previous video, you saw an effect that looked like falling rain. And this was just a very simple trick. So on screen you can see an image of simply lines, and these lines are vaguely reminiscent of fallen rain. This I downloaded off the web. I simply did a quick search for fallen rain texture, and this is what came up. It has no copyright attached to it, so I can use this in my image, in my project. Now, I wanted to have a yellow effect, again, that fit the style of my project, but I didn't need to have that. If I hide the yellow layer, you can see that this just looks like a white. You can see that this is just a gray image with various forms of lines of different brightness on it, and it looks a lot like rain. So in my original example, I already have the plane loaded and it's animated, and you can see how it just simply repeats the cycle of falling down. So let me show you how that works. And I'm going to go back to my original cutouts that I was talking about in the previous example, and I'm going to load in a 3D model of the rain plane. And this was literally just loaded into Blender as the default plane and then exported out. So now I have this plane in Vortals. And what I want to do is I want to apply this texture to it. And to do that, I change from fast shader to basic shader. So with this selected, I come here, and instead of having a fast shader, I select basic shader. And now under advanced options, I open out the shader details tab, and I'm first going to load that rain image as an opacity image. And so now we can see through our plane, which is great. But what we also want to do is have some emission. So if I choose my emission image, I can choose either the white or I can choose the yellow. So now I close the shader details tab, and I can move my rain into position. I'll rotate it. And our poor detective's going to have some rain in the office. And I'll scale it to the size that I want. And now I can animate this. So if I move the plane, you see at the moment the plane is a little too much in screen. So what I want to do is I want to scale it up a little bit more. So that the rain doesn't appear at the base of the screen, it takes up the whole screen. And now I can animate this. So I'll add my keyframe here, and I'll drag it down. And I believe that that won't be seen, so I choose Add Keyframe. And so now I have a 10-second animated loop. If I choose Loop, now I have an animated 10-second loop. Now rain is falling in this office. Now, of course, that doesn't necessarily make sense, but you can see the technique that I've applied in order to achieve this rain. And so if we go back to our original scene, you can see how this creates the effect of fallen rain. If you've decided to go with the Cyberpunk feel, there are a couple of steps you need to take in Vortals to achieve this sort of glowy, contrasty, bright look. So when you apply a texture, the first thing you'll need to do is select a camera and activate your camera effects. Now, depending on the type of slide you have, you'll have different camera effects available. But most importantly of all, you will have bloom in every type of slide. So when you apply the bloom, you can see in this scene what happens. The objects start to glow. So bloom creates a camera effect whenever there is a bright object. So if I select my my light here and I make it very, very bright, you'll see that everything starts to glow. And so that's what the camera effect is doing. It is blooming the camera whenever there's a bright object. So that is one initial start. You can use lights and intensity mixed with the camera effects to achieve this bloom effect. Now the other thing that you can do is you can use a texture in order to actually achieve that as well. So if you want to achieve a cyberpunk feel instead of a film noir feel, you're going to be wanting to try create this glow effect. And in Vortals, there's a very particular way you have to do that. So here's a scene that I've loaded in, and in it, I'm going to select my camera. And you'll notice that with my camera, I have camera effects active. Now, depending on the type of slide you have, you will see different types of camera effects. But all of the slides will have the option for bloom. And you can see that as I raise and lower the bloom, the glow effect appears and disappears in the scene. So with the bloom fully enabled, there are two types of ways that you can achieve this glow effect out of objects. The first is through actual lights. So if I select a point light and I raise its emission value, you can see that the brighter the light gets, the more things will glow. So the glow is related to the intensity of the light that's in the scene. So if you add lights and you make them brighter, then you'll get more glow with your bloom activated in the camera effects. So again, if I remove the bloom, you won't see any actual glow from the lights. Now the other way to do this is with a texture. So when you select an object and you open out the advanced shader details, you can create a glow using emission. So if I remove all the emission, you'll see there's nothing happening. And then as I emit more and more light into the scene, there's more and more of a glow. And the amount of glow and the color of the glow and all of those things are related to the image itself. So you'll need to think very carefully about the nature of the image that you're using to create the glow in your scene. But this is how you can create that cyberpunk feel. And again, as you can see, having reference to the style that you want to achieve will be really useful in order to help you actually make the scene look like you want it to.